Hello, everybody. So welcome back to week 4 of 8. So we're almost halfway through. Uh, some of your other classes, you might have midterms this week. So our class is very much just project based. So no midterm exams for us. Another one was reading knowledge checks, but those are very low stakes. They just kind of confirm reading. And once again, a reminder on that. If you see any questions that seem like they don't belong there, I keep going back through. If you see any questions that just seem like they don't fit with the reading assignment, please let me know. I think I got them all filtered down, but I was sitting there staring at a computer screen for many hours. I was bringing those question banks in, so I might have missed a couple or clicked the wrong correct answer, clicked the wrong button for which one was the correct answer or something. So if you notice any typos or anything, let me know. Today, I'm going to go over some notes on storytelling. Some things about storytelling, because that's what we're usually doing with the game, is telling a story. A couple of games have got by without a story, right? And unless you're making a game as great as Tetris or as world shattering as Pong was when it came out in the early 70s, you're probably going to use the video game to tell a story. And in particular, these are notes that I borrowed from one of the English professors here when she was teaching creative writing a few semesters back. I was teaching this class at that time, and I was like, hey, actually, I go over storytelling. Can I borrow your notes just to emphasize that point? So we'll look at that. Then we're going to look at the next step for skeletal animations. Look at that imagery. Graphics to get ready to do the skeletal animations, and we'll kind of go through the process. There's two main ways that it's handled in like all of our software that we would do it in, and most places where we can do a 2D skeletal animation, we have both. We have access to both ways. Then there's another style. It has to do with the parent-child relationships, and the way the tutorial works through it. The reading assignment for this week, it has the bone becomes the parent of a shape, and then that shape is the parent of graphics. And alternative, the other way is the bone can actually be the parent of the graphics. I like the latter one because I think it makes it easier when we go to code of the animations. What we're going to be doing in here, we're dragging our mouse around. Won't be doing a whole lot of coding, but it when we go to writing in our scripts, there's an extra layer of parent-child relationships that we have to keep track of there. So it's not significantly harder, but at least personally, I make a lot of mistakes having the extra parent-child relationships, the something dot something dot something, all of that stuff. But it's just a little bit more time when we get to the scripts. And when we do the shape way, there's another node that's combined into that shape. Two different nodes were combined into that shape. So if we do a direct bone parent of the graphics directly, we have to add that other node back in. But it's then it just sits in the middle. Not really any. We'll talk about that when we get to it this afternoon. Depending on how time goes, might look a little bit at inverse kinematics. That's so what we'll see is we'll set the bone. Our graphics are like skin, and we'll set the bones, and then just like as we move our bone and the skin comes along, our skin comes along with it. Kind of that style of animation. It works a lot better for programming and scripting it to do things. But enough. We will just be moving the bones directly, controlling the rotation and the location. That's just direct control. And alternative way to move it is what's called inverse kinematics, and has all kinds of big fancy words. And you start watching tutorials about it, they'll jump right in and start talking about things. And It sounds super complicated when you hear the actual terminology, but it's like the marionette puppets, where there's just a couple key control points. You probably haven't thought about it consciously in a long time, but if you pay attention when you're walking, the only thing we think about is our ankle. We think about it just where our ankle's going, and everything else comes along with it. You don't have to manually worry about our hips and thigh, calves. We just put our ankle in the spot it needs to be, and everything else just comes along with it. That's how those marionette puppets work. So we'll try to talk about it today, or maybe a little bit on Wednesday. See some key points on it. It's a little harder to set up in graphics, and when you once the setup's done, it's easier to control because then you just have like four or five control points that so you move that control point, and the rest of the body comes along with it. So I don't know how much we'll do in class of that in class examples, but at some point in the future, if you go to look into it, just think about the marionette puppets, those little puppets with the strings. Because any reference material for it has big, complicated sounding words, makes it sound like something super advanced, but marionette puppets, those hollow puppets predate writing, so it's something people have known about for a long time. There's a lot more setup, but then you have fewer points to worry about when you do the animation. And then we will do breakout rooms again, so the group can meet while you're here if you want to, or if your group has some other, if your group's moving along nicely, you can, that'll be the last thing today. But I'm going to try to get about an hour in the same place. It's not the same as traditional group work where everybody would be sitting in the same classroom. That makes it a lot easier. But at least on the Zoom call, can talk to each other instead of just leaving messages or sending emails or however your group chose to communicate. So we'll have time for that today. Okay. So first off today is storytelling. That's in many ways, video games are just the latest format of storytelling, something highly ingrained in humanity. Right? For eons, that was how all knowledge was passed down. All of history, everything that was known, was just worked into stories. And then instead of like modern education system where we lecture and go through the facts, all those facts were subtly worked into stories that were more memorable and would be passed down through the generations. It's very ingrained in humanity, right? A 3-year-old can tell if your story is not very good, and will usually tell you themselves. Be like, that's not a very good story, right? A 3-year-old can't tell a good story yet, but they know how to recognize whether your story is good or not. It's something that's very ingrained in humanity. So it's also very well studied from English professionals. So that's why I borrowed the notes from one of the professors here that teaches creative writing, is just to emphasize that point that it's crossing over. It's not something new. It's well studied, and the knowledge about telling a good story that English professional or language professionals have studied for a very, very long time still apply to a video game. We're just doing it in a different format. So some key parts here: the plot, the main events, the primary conflict. Main events or primary conflict. What will happen during the climax of the story? What is the main crisis in the story? The rising and action events that lead up to the conflict. What happens in the falling action? Events that occur after the conflict. So the rise, fall, ebb and flow, and there's going to be different levels of them. If your story is plot driven, work to make sure that the main events of your story are balanced out by elements so that it doesn't have then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? That you don't want that step-by-step procedure. You want to balance it out with things, think ebb and flow. And talk about with the 3 acts. I'll put it over here, that way I can keep pointing back to it. You think about it as the 3 act process. We're there yet. So in the first act, that's where we introduce everything. Introduce our characters, bring in the setting where they're at, maybe lead into Act 2, which is going to be our conflict, the crisis, the interesting part of the story. I'll put that here. And then Act 3, which is going to be the resolution or absolution. Resolution just means everything wraps up neatly, everything falls in place at the end. Absolution means to release from guilt. The Die Hard movies would be a good example of absolution. He stopped the terrorist at the end, so it didn't matter how much damage was done. I think in one of them, he blew up an entire airport. That's $2 or $3 billion in damage, but it didn't matter because the hero of the story stopped the terrorist he was after.
For like the Avengers.
Yes, yeah. The Avengers kind of came back on that in a later movie, where they were in trouble over all the damage they caused. But yeah, that's what absolution is. And the key thing is, once you hit Act 3, wrap it up and wrap it up quickly, for better or worse, right? The interesting part of the story is over, so wrap it up quickly, whichever method works best. Video games probably have a lot of absolution because in a lot of video games, there's going to be a lot of destruction happening along the way to the interesting part. Obviously, in a game, most of it's going to be Act 2, right? We have our cutscene, introduce the characters, then the interesting part, and there will be layers of these as you tell your story, right? So the introduction isn't just like here's so and so, and then you jump right to the main part of the story. There's going to be a sub Act 1, 2, and 3, right? You start the introduction, and then something interesting happens to kind of fill it out. And then as that wraps up, then you move into the main Act 2 for the story. So think about it like the layers like that. We'll make sure I have that ebb and flow, the rise and the fall, right? The rise, the climax of the story, and then the fall afterwards is some traditional terminology used with it. Another main point to keep in mind is the narration or POV, point of view for the story. The first, second, third person narrator. I'm reading from an English person's notes, thinking about writing it, right? Is it I or he or they or all-knowing narrator telling the story? But we have a similar thing in games, right? Is it a first-person game? Side view, isometric view, a straight overhead view. How are you telling it? If it's a third person view, well, I'll read it right from the notes. If told in third person, is the narrator omniscient? Omniscient. I would have said omnipotent. Right? Is the narrator all knowing? Do they know everything, see everything? And a similar thing in games, if the game's being shown like a side-scrolling platformer or third-person view where you're behind the character in 3D game the whole time, how much do you know that the character itself would not see?
Or honestly, how much does the character know that you wouldn't? you know, like if it's time you platform, particularly the characters, you know more and then you are.
Yes.
Actually see it. You can see the small area.
Yeah, if the player can, if a first person view would only give a little bit of the world, and switching up to the third person, does that give you significantly more information than what you would have in the first person view? Because that's going to affect everything. How the story is told. How a story is told affects every impact, affects every other aspect of the story. Impacts every other point storytelling. Back to the act 2 of the story, or a sub act 2 of one of the acts, somewhere built in there. Does the player know more than the game character about what the conflict is, what the crisis is? The puzzles that might need solved, things like that. Mood. That's the next one on the list. What mood are you trying to convey in your story? Dark, light, humorous, funny? How can all the elements of fiction in your tale work to convey that mood? This is one where game developers have a big advantage over traditional writers when these notes were written for. Think about one of the standard examples is blue curtains, right? Tattered blue curtains blowing in the breeze coming through the window to signify depression and sadness, that sort of thing. But in game development, we can actually draw some ripped up blue curtains by a broken window and a dark room and really set a depressive mood instead of just describing it. So one mood is one that one place that where telling a story through video games really excels over the traditional written form. Yeah. Yeah. Style, design. What feelings does it evoke? I'll put it that way.
Art style requirements. It's how big place to work.
Yeah. Yeah. See, there's no here. It's good to think about what you're going for mood wise and make your choices based on the mood. For example, if someone in your story is going to die, in a light-hearted story, that death would be dismissed in some way. Whereas a darker story, that death might carry a lot more weight. Does that make sense? That's another standard example. A very light-hearted story, everything just gets shrugged off and you move on with the lightheartedness of the story, and any emotional impact from it is shoved aside. Or otherwise, in a dark story, you're going to dwell on that stuff.
That also depends on if you want to take the theme twist it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a good way to manipulate stuff. So going over the basics here. Another one that fits in here, since the point of using these notes is showing the crossover to different subjects where it's well studied. From psychology, color theory fit in there. The choices in colors have a huge emotional impact on people immediately. So things like that. And for game developers, we're not just describing stories like novelists. We're actually going to show that stuff there. So we don't leave as much to the player's imagination.
Show don't tell unless there's written more.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, what was that, Josh?
Show don't tell unless you have written more.
Yeah.
Pick up.
Yeah. Yeah, so a different way of telling a story, but again, humans, storytelling is very ingrained in humans. So you want to make sure you can know the components of a good story.
So which I would do in the. Of course, there were cutscenes, but most of the actual lore you could skip past if you don't care to read it.
Yeah. But not just in video games. Think about all the books you've read, the movies you've seen, plays you've seen. What makes one good, or what makes, beyond the format that it's told in, what makes that good, right? The reason that movies, books is movies in book form or books in movie form aren't quite the same, right? So what's missing? What was missing when they took the Harry Potter series from the book and put it on the big screen? Or going the other way, Star Wars was done first, and they took and moved that into books. What was different when, like, the original Star Wars trilogies was put in books immediately and comics immediately, and when they were retelling the same story, it just wasn't as good. But then whenever those comics like moved on to unique stories, they got better. So what was missing when they transitioned formats? Think about that. So like everything you know about storytelling, and focus on the other aspect of that. So characters, here in the notes, who are the main characters? How do the main characters help drive the story forward? So the NPCs, in our case, what do they do to keep the story moving along? What actions will they take, and what other elements in the story will influence those actions? What will happen to them, and how will your audience be affected by these outcomes? So how does the character tie back to the mood? Are you expecting the audience to fall in love with the character, so that when characters get killed off at some point on the way through the game, there's going to be a huge emotional impact on the audience member? What are your characters' names, styles, physical attributes, personality traits? So yeah, for writing, that has to be described explicitly, but for us, that's getting into the graphics and the animations, things like that. What are their flaws, right? Perfect characters are just perfect heroes are just too unrealistic. There's been a big movement in that over the past couple decades in Hollywood with the anti-hero thing. Is perfect heroes, right? The old with some of the old westerns, John Wick, John Wayne, where John Wayne was the hero, everything was so predictable all the way through. Or the Lone Ranger, way back to the 1950s, the original Lone Ranger, it was just so predictable and cheesy because heroes are humans, and our characters are humans, and humans have flaws. So without including those flaws, it lacks a sense of realism in a way.
But when also anti-heroes tends to be a more gritty story, like Punisher and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but just the bringing that. Well, even in the Avengers, you mentioned that a moment ago. Some of the other things where the internal conflict and the strains on their personal lives and stuff. Bringing that stuff in makes the characters seem so much more real. What motivates them to act? What are their goals? What are they after? Right, and the whole why of the game. Why are they playing Why is somebody playing the game? That's introduced to the character, and then building attachment to that character. How do the minor characters interact with the major characters? Why does the story need any of these characters? Then the side note, the idea is to create complex characters who matter to your audience. It can help you create a character's sketch to flesh out your characters. That's just a tip for writers. That's something we pretty much have to do in a game anyway, sketch out our character. But people learning creative writing are told to do that very same thing. Draw a picture of your character, and then that way you can look at them and think about how they would react in a certain situation. I'm just going to leave characters on the board list there because there's so much to go into, and it's in games it's a lot more obvious. The characters and the objects and all of that really stand out. Dialogue's an important one. What do these characters say to one another? How can you reflect natural speech patterns? This is one of the hardest things in writing stories. What I struggled with for probably haven't told you all this. There were several years that I thought I want to be a novelist. So I made sure I spent 35 to 40 hours a week writing novels. Some publisher out of Baltimore flipped the bill for printing and for publishing them and pay for an agent. I'm not good at self-promotion, and people buy from authors they know. So my stuff filled space nicely when popular authors ran low, but I think I made $17.60 in royalties, and then the copyrights just kind of expired and came back to me. But dialogue was one of the hardest things to do because I was sitting there writing all the dialogue. So it's really hard to make it not seem like the same person talking both ways. One thing I found that was helpful is to come back on different days and different moods. So if I was in a bad mood, I'd make it a point to come back and edit out just one character's dialogue, not all the characters. And have the basic sketch there, but I'd always make it a point to not edit both sides of the dialogue on the same day, to try to make it seem like more two different people talking. That's kind of a hard thing to do, and that's a big one where groups come in for as far as game development. Different people can write the different characters' dialogue and help spread that out, and then it has the unique voices in it. But let's see, how can you reflect natural speech patterns to keep dialogue from feeling too silted? What is your character's style of speech like? Playful, serious, hurt, loquacious, still, casual? I'm not sure what loquacious means. I might have to look that word up. Still, casual, formal, rude, sweet, selective, careful, and so on. And are all of the characters different along those lines? Because the dialogue will definitely not seem natural to that one. Yes, sir.
Cases is to talk a great deal.
Okay. Yeah, one of those English professor words that rarely shows up in normal conversation, I guess.
Friends most people say talk a bit, so possible.
Yeah. How can their speech indicate their upbringing, education, worldview, concerns, all of that stuff? Why are characters speaking to one another? That's an important one for video games. Like, why do they need to talk to each other? Will interactions between characters be used to convey something major, revealing? In the case of a video game, probably. Somewhere along the way, we're going to have NPCs point us in the right direction in most games. Kind of the other elements, the plot, the narrative, the point of view, the mood, how do those affect the dialogue? Remember that dialogue can do a lot of the work in a story in terms of plot and character development, and anything can be revealed through the dialogue. Usually we have a couple options. Almost all of our game engines have text-to-speech built into them. So we can just, in our code, we put a string there and have the text-to-speech libraries read it out. One problem with that, if anybody's a Linux user, has probably encountered it. Not a lot of voice models have donated their stuff. So it's kind of expensive to get good voice models. Not too bad. There's other resources that cost a lot more, but it's certainly not cheap to get really good voice models. And if you have a lot of characters doing where you do the text to speech, you're gonna need to buy a lot of different voice libraries.
So for a project in this class, does anything actually need to be voiced? It's going to read it off the screen.
Reading it off the screen would be the other one, right? That's kind of a standard. That's been a standard since long before text to speech existed. It's to just kind of put the words up there. And also, that also works to, they started to do that less at one point and then brought it back because it makes a nice pause point. Right, where you're going through that dialogue reading, click to the next screen. It gives the player a moment to like go refill their drink or stand up and.
And then also the player can fit their own voices for that character as well.
Yes, yeah. It brings back in some of that imagination aspect because that's.
Look at Scratch come up with a voice and stuff.
Yeah, so something to keep in mind. These are all the things you want to consider when telling a story is basically what it is. The setting of the story. Where and when does the story take place? When and where? Fairly straightforward, but how do these affect other choices or elements in the story, right? If your game's taking place in medieval Europe, it's probably going to look really dirty. You're not going to have your bright colors would be used sparingly, right? Royalty or the pied, which actually pied was worn by executioners. They didn't wear a black hood. That's completely an American Hollywood recreation. The pied, the court jesters, is how we think of them. That was actually how the executioners dressed. And the Hollywood made it, and the court jesters were like comedians. They wore normal clothes, like everybody else. It was the executioners that had the bright, funny hats and the curly toes. But when you have bright colors like that, it would be completely overboard, right? You don't have a bright colored hood. If there's any bright color, it's like that whole pied design. Everything would be dirty versus if it's happening in a setting for your story is like the modern world, maybe same city in Europe in 2020 or 2025 instead of the Middle Ages. It's going to be a lot cleaner and lots of bright colors like we see in our world, right? So that stuff affects how it would be told, the mood of it. Obviously ties back into the plot because not every plot would fit in medieval Europe, just like not every plot would fit in some European city in 2025. What details do you use to convey time and place? So if you don't explicitly say it, how do you let people know where it is? How do you let people know the game's taking place in feudal Japan? Language and dialogue choices, and how much of a driving force will the setting be? Games that happen in space, like battles between ships and stuff, the setting itself is a major factor in all of the other things because interactions in space would be very different for the plot. The POV is probably going to be different because you probably want to go all out on the cool backgrounds if your game's happening in space. Neat looking planets, things like that. So with each one of these things, it's not don't take it in isolation. As you're putting your story together, think about how do these things tie together. Be careful unless trying to achieve a comedic effect. Avoid anachronisms. The overplayed stereotypes. For example, a hot tub would not show up in the Mongol Empire. More subtly, a zipper would not show up in 18th century England. Like, if you're doing a Wild West game, you wouldn't have your cowboy in a zipper jacket. It wouldn't make sense. Red Dead Redemption did that. On one of the characters in Red Dead Redemption has a zipper jacket. It takes place like 30 years before a zipper was invented. Symbols. So what sort of symbols appear in your story? Represent ideas, themes, etc. How can you strategically place these symbols in your story? In video games, symbols are often going to be used to guide a player to a puzzle when it's maybe a more difficult puzzle. What effect are they meant to achieve? How do characters interact with the symbols? How do these interactions move the story forward? For example, the dying rose with falling petals is a magical symbol. Try this sentence again. It's much easier to talk than like read a sentence directly from a piece of paper. For example, the dying rose with the falling petals is a magical symbol in Disney's Beauty and the Beast that is meant to represent the passage of time and the presence of the curse. As the petals fall, the curse nears its end, and the conflict in the story intensifies. Different characters in the story interact with this rose in different ways, and those interactions help to move the story towards its climax, which in the case of that one is the end of the curse. So how does that stuff play in? All right, and again, just think about these main items here, and how do they affect all the different ones? How do the symbols affect the plot, right? How do they keep that moving along? How do they show up? How do we see them? What's the point of view? What sort of mood do the different symbols give? Themes is, well, in video games, we're going to have design themes. This is the other thing. The theme is a subject or idea that weaves itself throughout a story and often holds it together. Might also think about it as the lesson, the moral of the story. What are you trying to convey with the story? Lessons meant to be learned by the characters or audience. What will your theme or themes be? Where you're trying to show or teach your audience? How do the other elements, these things up here, how do these other things affect the theme? How do they affect the message you're trying to get across? Subtle background. Some common themes: unrequited love, good versus evil, curiosity, family relationships, friendships. Those themes often show up in video games, right? Why somebody good versus evil is a very common one, but oftentimes the character in a game is trying to do something for friendship or family or for familiar reasons, do it for their family, that sort of thing. Getting into the why the story is being told. And the last one on here is the audience. Who is your target audience for the story? If you're making a game that you expect people in the 4 to 9 year old range to play, you're going to make it very different than you would if it's something for adults or teenagers. It's different lengths of different attention spans, and those little kids aren't going to focus very long on stuff. You need to keep it moving along and keep grabbing their attention over and over and over again. But if the game's kind of intended as a long story for adults to play after work and every night for the next month, right, you can really drag out some of the parts. How are the individual choices you make meant to affect the audience, right? how does the mood affect the audience? How is that particular setting going to impact the audience? The audience's emotional connection to it. Is it something very relevant? Right? Like, I was trying to think of an example other than Vice City, but Vice City happens in modern cities in America. They give them different names, but they did actually go out to the cities and grab the GIS data and put that in there, which when we get to 3D modeling is built into Blender. It's really, really easy. And Google Earth, the data for Google on Google Earth is publicly available. So we can just grab any spot on Earth and put that landscape or cityscape right into our game. So it's something people will recognize and be familiar with versus some game happening in feudal Japan. Some samurai game happening in feudal Japan. Nobody in the world is really has experienced that, right? That's a world that ended quickly at the end of World War II. When Japan surrendered and industrialized in the American fashion, there's still remnants of that. There's still Japanese culture is very different than American culture in a lot of ways, and there's still a lot of remnants of that traditional stuff. But nobody alive has really experienced living in that world. So it's more of a fantasy world for any modern audience. So how do all these things impact each other is the main thing you want to ask or think about. Why should the elements you create on this or the story itself matter to the she put readers because it's from her English class, but why should the story matter to the players? Why is it important and not just dragging them along, which kind of comes back into the theme, which is going to tie into like morals and lessons. What's the big takeaway you want them to have after being engaged in your story? So 3-act system, Act 1, most of it happens in the interesting part happens in Act 2. So most of a video game is going to be Act 2, right? That's where we're playing. Maybe a little introduction level, get used to the controls, run around. Legend of Zelda games are really good about that, right? At first you run around and talk to a couple NPCs, and then you go out and start the actual game. So then most of it happens here, and every once in a while there's a little break for interaction with NPCs, and then at the end the resolution for Legend of Zelda, it's usually resolution. It resolves up nicely if you at the end of the game. To think about other games you've played, but not just games, movies you've seen, plays. If you've seen any operas, musicals, stories you've read, poems you've read over the years, all the different stories you've heard, because the important parts are still the same for this format of storytelling. Any questions about those? Kind of make sense? Does it sound like things you've heard an English teacher tell before? I think most of us have some. There's a little bit of creative writing worked into high school English at least, but here at Ivy Tech, if you're really wanting to pursue games, you can go take a creative writing course here and apply those concepts to the stories you're telling in your game. Because good storytelling is good storytelling regardless of form. The other thing I want to put up here is just talk about maybe. I don't necessarily need to write it on the board. Has to do with tips. Because sometimes the story is just going to flow out and you're barely going to be able to keep up with it, right? You have an idea and you're just working as fast as you can just to get that idea down so you don't lose that story. Those kind of storytelling is easy. But if you're like trying to pursue a career in game development, sometimes you're gonna have to come up with stories when you're not feeling quite so creative. So you might need some sort of method, some sort of process to do that. So in the years that I was writing novels, what I came up with when I didn't have an idea for a story was I would, to force something out, I would sit down and start sketching out like half of a season of a TV show. So I would come up with a super basic plot, like something like Captain on a spaceship. I wrote sci-fi books, so that was something like that, and running around working as a bounty hunter or something, tracking people down. Then I'd come up with one character, and then I'd list out 11 episodes. And then I'd start with Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and kind of break that episode down into good 3 to 4 scenes in each one of these, and just labeling it out, right? So have like a plot, something like Captain on Spaceship. Maybe a freighter. Say something different than I just said. Freighter, avoiding pirates. Pirates and government officials, something like that. Trying to keep to themselves mostly, but having trouble doing that even in the vastest. And then I'd start writing out so like episode 1, and I'd always go for 11. So this isn't a Word document where you can come back and edit like the board. So I'd just make those labels: episode 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 11, which would be half of a TV series, and start writing it as a script. Then I'd break that down. So I know there's going to be an Act 1, Act 2, and an Act 3 for every episode, and I just kind of go through what needs to be in a story, and go through elements like this. I had a slightly different list, but since that's the one we went through, right? Every act's going to have maybe 3 scenes. Scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. 1, 2, 3, and if you do 3 or 4, then it ties back into this. So there's the intro to Act 1, the interesting part of Act 1, and the resolution of Act 1 before you move into the Act 2, which is the interesting part of the overall story. And I would just kind of start filling this in and make up characters and visualize myself watching that as a TV series week to week, and just kind of pictured that like a TV series I was barely paying attention to. Something, maybe a roommate's favorite show. So it was on in the background, and then I'd like catch different pieces and I'd get them on there. And then before long, there's starting to be a sketch that can be turned into a story. That was my method when one needed forced out. If the story's flowing freely, don't get in its way. But try to come up with something that you can apply all of these elements. And a structured format, that way you're still moving forward when you need to create a story and you're not feeling creative. Just kind of a tip there. Yeah, that was mostly what I had to tell about storytelling. The big things, kind of like the introduction, what I introduced it with. A 3-year-old might not be able to tell a good story, but they can and will tell you when you're telling a bad story. Humans recognize good storytelling, and it's often somewhat expected in a game. Okay, so you ever heard about time? not doing any questions or anything, so. I guess when we get started in the next thing we're gonna look at, this week is when so module 4, right, the module 3 stuff is due tonight. I don't think there was very much module 3 stuff. What else? Was it just the knowledge check and the discussion board? Oh, yeah, and then the next game's not due till next Monday, so. So a couple things due tonight, but for the next module, module 4, we're gonna do our next animation. And a lot of people like this style of animation a little bit better than the sprite sheet one, because in sprite sheet, you all saw we have to draw every single picture, or we copy and paste and make small adjustments, but we have to set up every single frame. This is the one with skeletal animations. It's more a programming thing. We'll just draw the image once, and then we'll have the computer manipulate it into the shapes, into the stances for the animations we want to draw. And it's something that can be scripted a lot. Once we get it set up, we can do it in our scripts a lot better. So I'm gonna create a new document to work with. Maybe put a cough drop in my mouth so that we'll stop coughing for a few minutes. There we go. I'm gonna start by just drawing what I want the character to look like. You can do a very quick one here. Obviously, the one for yours needs to spend a little bit more time, but I'm just gonna do a quick dragon example. So I'll do like front of the nose, come around. Maybe not the best one I've ever drawn, but let's see, after drawing that, I'll open the fill and stroke, adjust the colors a little, maybe a little darker than that. That'll work. But then the head of the dragon. And we want to draw all the parts separately. So after the head, I'm gonna come back through here and have sort of the torso body of a dragon. Here, draw the tail coming out. And you would probably break it up into a couple pieces. Right? So that tail is just one long thing. So when we go to animate that, our options are going to be to swing it back and forth. But if you might want it to curl or something, if you drew it in 3 different pieces, then when we get to the animation, you have 3 different pieces that you can position around. So for your homework assignment, where more time allows, think of something like that, like your tail. You have the base of the tail, then a midsection, and then an end, and you'll be able to move all 3 of them independent of each other to get different shapes. But that's time consuming and hopefully makes sense there, right? And for your leg, instead of drawing one image for the leg, draw like the upper leg, the lower leg, and the foot all different, and then you have more control when you go to animate. I'm not going to do that here because we're very tight. We're under tight time constraints, and we just want to see the process. Let's see. So I'll come over here and draw a front leg now. Grab my pencil. So kind of knee, come down, and then maybe sort of like a clawed foot for the dragon, something like that. I'm gonna copy and paste that, so if I copy that, and paste it. Kind of where the other leg would go. And I'll just make it a little bit darker green, that way it stands out. And then we can drop it down in the order, so lower to the bottom, that way that leg that's further away from us, we can, a little shading to make it seem like it's back. Maybe the front leg I'll make a little bit lighter, that way it stands out from the body, not that much. Just a little bit, but, normally the standing out from the body would be done with, shadows and things like that, other details that we work in there. Right here and, to the back leg. And down into a big clawed foot. Back, copy and paste that. About where we can get them in position. So they look right, and then I'll just come back to this first one and copy the color from here. That way it's consistent. Paste that color in, and again move it behind everything. So the basic shape, I guess we can put wings on here. That'll work. Maybe make the wings a little bit brownish in color. So you're gonna wanna spend a little bit more time than this, but make sure you do every piece separate. That would be important later. And again, I'll just make the one in the back a little bit darker. Oops. Oh, object in lower part. That'll work. Sort of gives the basic idea of the dragon. I'm gonna select everything here and reset it. Try to make it fit in this area, 512 by 512. Just to make it all fit in there. That'll work. Spend a little bit more time, maybe break your legs up into several pieces so you have more control over the shape of them when you go to animate it. Because it'll just be more of the same steps per scene. We get some sort of image, and it's useful to have a reference image. So let's go ahead and export this once. Actually, instead of exporting it somewhere and then importing it in Godot, before I save it, I'm going to start a new project in Godot. Create a new project. Skeleton. Yeah, I'll just call it skeleton for skeletal animation. And now when I go to save this, I can just save it right in that project. Because that's all an import is. When we bring it in, we just save it. We just copy it from wherever it was saved into our project. I'll go in here. The dragon, and then we can start making some exports on it. So we export this in the like drawing order, where we want all these positions. Because when we start putting bones in there and connecting these things to the bones we have drawn, it might shuffle them around. So it's useful to have a reference image that we can refer to. I'll just export the whole thing and call it reference. Yeah. But now there's two different ways. I would highly recommend checking into both of them because I brought in some videos. There's the reading assignment. I should talk about that. When that tool was first created in Godot, they wrote that documentation, the written version of the tutorial, and they made a video tutorial. That was in Godot 3.1. That was like 10 years ago. And over the years, the official one, the written version, your reading assignment for this week, has been updated with every new update to the game engine and is kept up to date. But the video has never been updated. So a couple things are out of date in that video. I went back and forth, but thought it would probably be helpful. Most stuff is still in a similar spot, but when we get over to Godot, I'll point out where the one thing that's drastically different. So you don't spend forever looking at video, but it's two, I think like 12-minute videos. And then the way we're gonna do it today is not gonna take very long at all. So like our recording after class would be like a 20-minute video. So it's not gonna take long to look at both ways and see if you prefer one or the other. It's not gonna take long based on how much time you're probably gonna want to spend on putting together a nice animation this week. But either way, we need these parts separate. So now we have that reference image, so we can just kind of move things around, reorganize them on our scene here, where they're where they're all separate, where they're not overlapping each other. Which I don't think is going to fit in this same area, so I'm going to have to change the size of this file. Bring that down. Okay. I don't think anything's still touching there. That one might be. How far down is that? That's I can't read the numbers on the screen. Oh, because my screen's dirty, that's why. 600. Make this a little bit bigger. Oh, 741. I did misread those numbers. And this one I can see about 610, maybe. There we go. So they're all included in an image, so we can export this image, and this is the one we'll actually use. The reference is just so we can line things back up in the original position. So I want to export this. Okay. The numbers hadn't updated. It still said 512 by 512 on the export. So I'll export this as parts. And this is what the tutorial follows along. It just has one thing where it's all in like a spreadsheet. What I like to do is use each one separate. So now I'm just going to grab each one individually and go to the selection, export the selection tool, and make sure you click this box that says export selected only. You can probably see it somewhere here. Yeah, notice how if the box overlaps with anything else, it's going to pick that other little part up. So make sure you hit that check box and then just export the parts one at a time. So this would be the head. And I'll call this back wing. So I have like a front wing and a back wing. Front being the side towards us and back being away from us. Even though it's a 2D image and they'll all be at the same distance. The lighter one will be a front leg or front wing. Export torso. Export the tail. What's this? This is the front. Back leg. That seems a weird label, but that'll help keep track of it. And this is the front leg. The rear back leg. And the rear. A couple of those words sounded weird, but think of the word to keep track of what's what. So for the method I prefer, I think it's a little easier to script in. I don't know how much we'll get to that today. It follows suit with the other stuff in Godot, right? It's in our scene hierarchy, and we just make a reference to it. Actually, all we need is a reference to the bone in our script. We can drag it in the same way we always do in Godot, and then just access its transform data. Yeah, after we see the drag and drop part here in a moment, it'll make sense what we're going to do with it. And we come over here. So we now have all of the different parts ready to be brought in. So real quick, actually, it's probably a good time to take a break, and then we can start into the animating part after a quick break. 10 minutes sound good to everybody? I see head nods here in the classroom. So my laptop says 2:09. We'll get back to it at 2:19 and starting to go through the animation. It's kind of a quick process, just some things to talk about, especially so that you'll know what to do when you go to script them, because after you see what we're going to do in the GUI, it's going to be very predictable what you do in the script. Follow suit with other stuff and get out. But let's take a quick 10 minutes and we'll get back to it at 2:19. See you all in just a moment.